For a little bit more analysis, we're joined now by TRT World's defence analyst, Oubai Shahbandar. Now, Oubai, throughout the day we've broken down a lot of different elements to do with the protests and the conflict, but by far the most overwhelmingly tragic is that of the humanitarian crisis. No question. According to UN reports, over 13 million Syrians are still in dire humanitarian aid, half of whom are children. So as you can imagine, this conflict has been getting worse and worse every year. A disproportionate of those who have been affected have been children. Around 1,000 young Syrian children have been killed this year alone. Healthcare facilities, hundreds of whom have been targeted and wiped out throughout the country. So we're seeing this repeated pattern of the humanitarian crisis being engineered as the Assad regime and its forces and its air force advance and bombard areas that have fallen under opposition control. So the fact that this year alone was the worst in terms of the humanitarian scale since the conflict began can only really tell us that this conflict is only getting worse and is likely to get even more worse in the year ahead, sadly. And you made a really interesting point there, because you talked about the bombardment and the taking out of medical facilities. So what we're sort of seeing is not just a humanitarian crisis, but also a health crisis emerging in the country as well. It's a health crisis under an unimaginable scale, and it's an engineered one. It's not just a byproduct of the fighting. We've seen time and time again the Assad regime targeting hospitals, targeting underground hospitals that have been built underneath the cities that are being targeted by barrel bombs, by airstrikes, by artillery strikes. Some of these hospitals have even been built in caves. So we're seeing a systematic approach by the Assad regime, by the Russian Air Force, to destroy humanitarian facilities, ambulances, healthcare facilities, and even underground children's underground bunkers, to include schools. So this humanitarian scale, in terms of the destruction, has never been worse. This year was the worst in the past 8 years. So as you can imagine, it's been getting worse every year as the years go by. And this is the 8th year, the 7th year anniversary of the Syrian Revolution, and we're seeing it just as bad as it's ever been. Traditionally in warfare, there's front lines and there's soldiers in battle, but what the Syrian conflict has really brought to the fore is this shift where civilian populations, city centres are being targeted, and as a result, we see much higher civilian casualties. The civilian casualties have been absolutely horrendous. In fact, as we stand here today, another horrific humanitarian disaster has taken place just a few miles outside of the city center of Damascus itself, in eastern Ghouta, a suburb of Damascus, the capital. We're seeing some desperate pleas for help from the families that are still stuck there as the Assad regime advances. We heard one report earlier from the ground that whole families have been wiped out by airstrikes. Thousands are attempting to flee as the Assad regime launches artillery attacks, rocket attacks, and airstrikes as it attempts to destroy the last rebel stronghold outside of Damascus. And of course, it's the civilians that are disproportionately targeted the most and really bear the brunt of the fighting. Yeah, absolutely. And if we sort of take it from a military or defence perspective now, there's a lot of talk about peace talks and these ongoing peace talks, but really are we at a point now where perhaps the biggest players in this, I'm talking about the Russias, the Irans, the United States, peace seems like a sort of way down the priority list, to be honest. Really, they're more interested in carving out their own kind of geostrategic positions. Well, as we hear all sides of the conflict talking about the need for a political solution for peace, the fact that the humanitarian situation is the worst it's ever been really speaks volumes. The United Nations and the United Nations Security Council, time and time again, have attempted to pass resolutions to stop the fighting, but it's been vetoed by the Russians, the ally of the Assad regime. It doesn't really seem that any of the major players in this conflict are working towards a peaceful political solution. The Assad regime, it's very clear, they believe they can win this war militarily. It's been 8 years. The Assad regime believes that it can win by killing all those that oppose it, but when we speak to the activists that are still on the ground, they are still holding out, they still have hope, and they tell us that the Assad regime cannot kill an idea, and the ideals behind the revolution that began 8 years ago. Yeah, and you can't sort of see, but behind us, sort of in the mist, are a whole ton of refugee camps. Now, the borders of Syria are the ones who've really picked up or borne a heavy burden with the influx of refugees and really tried to sort of take them on board. Do those countries need more support? They absolutely do, but you have to, at the end of the day, really deal with the root cause of the problem, with over half of the country of Syria either being displaced or forced to become refugees.
if you don't deal with the root cause of the problem, what's causing these people to leave their homes, to risk their lives and jumping in the Mediterranean, to risk the lives of their children, of their loved ones, to try to escape Syria. We have to deal with the root cause of the problem. Otherwise, we're going to be sitting here again 1 year from now talking about the same thing.
Okay. Oubai Shahbandar, thank you so much. Well.